Welcome to the Westminster Tradition podcast, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Danielle Elston and I am a recovering public servant and Managing Director of Good Government Advisory. Joining me today, I'm on Kaurna land, is fellow recovering public servant Caroline Crozer-Barlow, who I believe in this messy time at the end of the year, Caroline, is on Nungarry land. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Hello, Danielle.
Pleased today also to be joined by Mike Kaiser, who was most recently Director General of the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Queensland and is well known to public servants all over the country, if not only for his very active LinkedIn presence of thoughts that come up in the middle of the day and wise words to share with public servants. Mike, your CV, we normally do the CV read down, but I think it's more fun if you do this yourself because otherwise it'll be the first 10 minutes of me reading an extraordinary CV. Do you want to give us a potted history of where you have come from?
Oh, sure. I'm reminded that Steve Jobs at a Stanford University commencement address once said that his career only made sense to him in hindsight. I'm still waiting for that to happen for me. So rather than take you through a chronology, which would be quite dull, I thought I'd break it into kind of themes. And the first is the first theme of my career, I suppose, is the political, public service, private sector interfaces that I've seen from just about every perspective that you can get. So I've been a party official. I was briefly an MP in the Queensland Parliament. I was a Chief of Staff to two premiers, one in New South Wales, one in Queensland. I've been a Director General. I worked for a government business enterprise, NBN Co, and I was a partner at KPMG for quite a while doing private sector work, but also a lot of public sector work. So I've seen those interfaces from a range of perspectives, I suppose, is theme number one. The second theme is team leadership. I was thrust into leadership roles at a really young age, made a lot of really appalling mistakes, which I'm embarrassed about, but now find real joy in leading teams of people who are smarter than me to maybe help them to do things that they couldn't necessarily do for themselves. So leadership's a theme. And the other theme, believe it or not, even though I only worked in the profession for a couple of years after graduating, another theme is engineering, which I think is as a discipline is not something I regretted studying because it's held me in good stead. That problem-solving, logical way engineers go about things, I think, has held me in good stead in all the roles that I've held.
That's fascinating. And I must admit that my knowledge of your career kicked off with being an MP. And so discovering that you were an engineer was a bit of new information when we were putting this together. And we are going to get some of those other things. But one of the things I'm interested in about the engineer part of it is I often talk in some of the work I do with departments that might be full of lawyers or teachers or environmental scientists or former nurses, and they come at that with a set of professional kind of ways of thinking and training, and that we don't really have good ways in the public service of like keeping that. So you've obviously found being an engineer created value in a way of thinking, but you have to keep adding different skills to that make you a public servant and particularly to make you a public sector leader. So, you are no longer, unless you are in a role that is very straight down the line, you are no longer a nurse or a teacher or a biologist. You are now that and a public servant if you're in a department doing policy. You found it a strength. Have you also seen it be not necessarily a weakness, but it's something we grapple with in the service, which is that technical versus the actual craft of being a public servant, which is a thing all in of itself?
Yeah, look, I think all of those professions, no matter what they are, they help you to bring something to your career. For me, what being an engineer brings, and I still consider myself an engineer, is the scientific method of problem, hypothesis, experiment. Did it work? Keep doing it. Didn't it work? Stop doing it. The downside of that, I think, though, and if you're challenging me to identify a downside in that approach, is engineers can find ambiguity pretty difficult. Now, I think I've kind of learnt to cope with it, but that logical, linear, scientific method of problem solving can be a real hindrance if you're in a really complicated circumstance and don't know what the next step should be or even what hypothesis you should form. And so I think I've overcome it, but I think a lot of people with those kind of technical skills do have that challenge.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that was just limited to engineers.
Sure. No.
I think lawyers can find ambiguity also quite challenging, and they're not being, the life in the grey. I mean, I think a lot of government is life in grey, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not, there might be 7 answers and you might need to implement 3, which is not how a lot of academic and technical people are trained to be. So I think that's, it's different and it's challenging. But I think probably one of the things that is you're most, if not known for, is that difference between ministerial office and the public service. Mm-hmm. So most public servants have at one time or another wished that their advisor or chief of staff would win lotto and retire to the country. And there's that completely different approach, even in jurisdictions, as to the roles of ministerial officers. So looking back at being a chief of staff, kind of what do you regret about how you related to the public service now that you've spent time on the other side and realised that both have different kind of tensions to them?
There's not a lot I regret, I suppose. I mean, my attitude to the public service was always one that was pretty respectful, because I recognised out of pure political self-interest that there was a lot the public service had to offer in terms of bringing, the evidence and the longevity of experience that the public service can bring to decision-making. And so I always treated the public service as a resource to be tapped sensibly and wisely. So, I recall when I was Maurice Yemmer's chief of staff, John Pearce was the under-treasurer, head of the Treasury in New South Wales. And he was a fairly quiet-spoken but very intellectual, very thoughtful person. And he was teamed up with Michael Costa, who was a real kind of, live wire, very expressive, very quick-witted, very talented politician, but no one could get a word in edgewise. And so in budget meetings, I noticed John really struggling to get advice across in those meetings. And so I made a habit of always catching up with him before and or after meetings to say, John, I think there's more about this decision that we might need to know. What can you tell me? And in that way kind of provided a bit of a back channel, frankly, for John to make sure that his voice was heard by politicians. So there's not much I regret, but I mean, I do acknowledge that chiefs of staff come in all shapes and sizes and forms and temperaments, and not all of them are great at it. But I've got a real deep respect, having done the role, for the people who do those roles. And I think, it works both ways. The public service can be a bit more respectful sometimes of the challenges and the perspectives that chiefs of staff and ministerial staffers bring to their role. It's a bloody tough role. And, I think there's more we can do as public servants to kind of make that relationship work.
I think there's a bit of mystery though, right? So I think that's right. And sorry, my gag about wishing chiefs of staff would win lotto was not meant to be as disrespectful as perhaps it came across.
They often wish that there were some public servants who won the lotto and nicked off as well.
I think that there's always that people often have that experience of where you're speaking 2 different languages, where the public servant is trying to explain the barrier or the costing. Yeah. And sometimes the advisor is going the plough through or the COS, the plough through option. Yeah. And the advisor is frustrated because it seems like something that could be solved easily, because they may not understand some of the constraints of public servicing, and the public servant is frustrated because they don't feel like that they're all speaking the same language. And I think that part of it is that we just don't talk about the driving needs of what ministerial officers and advisors need, but also advisors often come in quite young. They don't understand things like the hierarchy of the public service, why picking up a phone and ringing a junior burger to get a quick answer might be a catastrophic problem if they have a horrible boss who doesn't, if there's a hierarchy issue. Yeah. There's not really a training of ministerial officers to understand, hundreds of years of how public sector places work. And equally, there's not a lot of training it's seen as political with a capital P instead of a lower class P to understand the drivers of, a Liberal government, a Labor government, a coalition government, a government that is in a minority, so we don't also train public servants to understand why those drivers are different, because it might be seen as political, and yet it's really hard to do your job if you don't understand the history of trickle-down economics, or if you don't understand the history of collective action or whatever else. And so do you think we don't do it well enough on both sides, like inducting ministerial officers into how the public service actually works and why a piece of paper might take 3 days to get to them, but in reverse, the public service understanding what drives politics?
Look, absolutely. The level of training and induction available for chiefs of staff are appalling, but I also think that, as a Director General of 3 agencies in Queensland, I was never offered an induction into the public service. I was recruited from outside the public service, had a strong awareness of public service values and ethics, having knocked around government in various forms, but there's no induction for anyone. And you get public servants, really senior public servants, come in from sideways into the public service who don't understand their role either. So it can be a bit of a comedy of errors. There's a
good description.
There's a mental model that I often found myself talking ministerial staff through, and that is, that any decision by government needs to have the evidence and the benefits of the longevity of the public sector. That's what we bring. What you bring is the political considerations, the potential for various stakeholder reactions, understanding that whole circumstance, which we don't have to bring. We each bring our separate parts, and your boss gets to decide. So just, and that's an impure model. It's not an imperfect model. But it just helps, I think, for people to understand their respective roles and understand that we're not there to second guess the politics, and they're not there necessarily to have the expertise that we have as public servants in terms of the evidence, the longevity, and having seen everything before. So as long as people understand and respect each other's roles, the relationship works better. But we also don't spend enough time just explicitly having that kind of conversation, that it's
100%.
that it's perfectly all right for you, politician, or for your boss to reject my advice.
Yes.
That's perfectly acceptable, because you have considerations that I'm not taking account of. So just, I found it very useful to just have those explicit conversations about respective roles and provide that clarity about the way things should work, at least in theory, to help build that relationship and to help people to understand what our roles are in the system.
Yeah, I mean, Alison hasn't joined us today, but she's a particular advocate or always talks about, just because you give advice doesn't mean it needs to be taken, and both ministers and the public service need to understand that and document it properly. This was what we thought the best advice was, but not approve or go in a different direction is a very available option to a minister. You just need to make sure that that's clear, that there is some clarity around it. You talked a little bit about your observations of coming back into the public service in 22 as finding it a bit more timid and maybe overly deferential to ministers, and called on kind of public servants to lift that boldness, give that best advice, have a go. People talk a lot about celebrating what didn't work, but find it really hard to talk about examples in practice. I mean, I don't know how many on the couches I've been to with CEs where they're asked about their experience, they're asked about this and that, and they're asked about what they've learned or what didn't work out. And the example is always wildly vague or not really. It's kind of like being asked in an interview, what's your weakness? Oh, I'm a workaholic. And their examples of what didn't work are often very much like that. It's something where they get to be the hero at the end of the day and save the project.
Yep.
Do you want to talk through an example of something where it just didn't work?
No.
Excellent.
Beautifully honest.
See? I really wish the on the couch CEs would be that honest and say, no, I don't want to, because this is public money, and so if it didn't work, I don't want to talk about it.
You might assume now that I've come to a mutual separation agreement with the Queensland public sector that I might be more willing to talk about. That's right. Not sacked. Mutual. It was a mutual decision, apparently. But so you might think I might be more willing to talk about mistakes, but it's all still a bit new and raw. So I don't want to give the new opposition in Queensland, any problems. But look, I think it's an important point. In every department I ran, I insisted on having a Fail Gallantly award. So the Fail Gallantly award went to someone who did their best, went about everything the right way, as long as they weren't corrupt or blindingly stupid. If they fell on their face gallantly in the pursuit of public interest, then they got that award. And without being really specific about it, some points come to mind. I mean, there was a case of an entire policy proposition which was worked on for a very long time, put to government and rejected. There was also, in my space, I spent a lot of time in industry development portfolios and roles, and in those kind of portfolios, if you're really pushing the envelope, if you're taking appropriate risk, if you're risk aware but not risk averse, you will recommend investments that don't work, and that was certainly the case. There were investments we recommended that the government make with public money that turned out not to be the case, but unless you're prepared to take a risk, unless you're prepared to fail gallantly, then you won't get anything done. So that was a value that we explicitly encouraged in agencies that I ran.
I love
That's
that.
amazing. Yeah. And I think some of those ones, I suspect, are policy ideas that you couldn't get the politics lined up on. So some of the best policy ideas, you just can't get all the stakeholders, you can't get enough of the cabinet, you can't get the kind of authorising environment, I suppose. It doesn't mean it's a terrible idea. It might be and it might get a second Guernsey, goes back in the bottom drawer, waiting for a different authorising environment because it's still a bloody good idea. And so I think failing gallantly where you've got the right idea, but you've failed on that basis of, as I said, the environment just wasn't right. We couldn't get the money, or we couldn't get all the stakeholders. It was going to not get through. Is such an excellent way to encourage people to still look for new ideas, even if the authorising environment you might need to wait a little while for that to kind of come together.
Yeah, but much worse is kind of overthinking that and not putting the proposition at all for fear of failure.
Yep.
I spent 10 years out of government in a sense. I like to say, even though it annoys public servants, I like to say, strictly speaking, my public service career looks like this. Class 1 engineer in Queensland Rail, Director General. I missed all the misses.
There must be a lot of Class 1 engineers at Queensland Rail thinking, my next gig.
So in terms of a strict public service career, that's actually what it looks like. But anyway, I knocked around in and around government in a lot of roles in between. But I had that gap of 10 years between 2009 leaving Anna Bligh's office as her Chief of Staff and 2020 when I joined the public service as the Director General of Resources in Queensland. So in that 10 years, I think I noticed, in a way that people who stayed in the system might not have, a real creeping timidity in the public service about the boldness of their advice, their willingness to engage in stakeholders, their ability to be risk aware but not risk averse. I recall really early on in the resources department, a very senior public servant, one of my direct reports, coming to me and saying, look, I really need you to line up a discussion for me with the minister. I need to write this briefing note on this particular topic, but I need to know what his view is so that I can incorporate it into the briefing note. And I went, hang on, why don't you just write the briefing note with our recommendation and the minister can accept or reject it? And it was like I was speaking a different language. So that concerned me. Here I was, supposedly the political guy being recruited into the public service. But because I've always had a deep respect for what every bit of the system, the role that every bit of the system should play, once I was a public servant, I thought, hold on, our role here is to depend on our experience and on the evidence to put advice that they can either accept or reject.
I won't say whose fault is that. What I will perhaps try instead is it a dual problem where ministers also don't have confidence to reject the advice, and that what they want to see in their inbox is something that's so well formed in the sense that it is pre-checked, and or do you think it is the public service who just for fear of wanting to please, or hang on, if I flip that around, for wanting to be good at their jobs and make sure their stuff got through, decided to proactively do that? So do you think there's anything that ministers and their officers have changed in that time that made the public service more timid?
Oh, look, I think it's the ferocity and the pace of the media scrutiny plays a part. It is tough for a minister to reject public sector advice because they're then held to account for that by the media and ultimately by the public if things go wrong. So it's a big call for them too. But I just think a bit more courage is needed everywhere and a bit more understanding of what those respective roles are. They can reject our advice on political grounds. That is perfectly legitimate. But we shouldn't do too much to second guess the politics of that because that isn't our role. It's their job. It's their job to blend the two and to come up with a decision. And if everyone,
robodebt.
Yeah, precisely. So if everyone just plays their role with a little bit of courage, the system works better.
So as the head of DPC, you get to be the head of intergov relations. And so
what a joy.
I can't tell. Is that a sincere joy there? Okay, move on.
If ever there was an industry of meetings. But anyway, did you get a sense in that part of your last role of the difference in the approaches of the Commonwealth and the state public services, or even between the state public services? Caroline and I get the opportunity in our day jobs these days and previously, but to knock around quite a lot of the different bits. And I feel like I could blind pick public service approaches from different jurisdictions and different levels of government now, in the sense of you just talk for 5 minutes and I will, off the top of my head, decide if you are, a Commonwealth public servant or from Victoria or did you get a sense heading up IGR that all public sector is not the same and all the approaches can be very much jurisdictionally based or level of government based?
And different public sector jurisdictions around the country at the moment, I think, have different strengths. And it partly comes from political leadership, but it also partly comes from public sector capability. There's a very, very strong, very capable Cabinet Office in New South Wales at the moment, for example, that I've got a lot of time for, and I really admire the people in it. And they, I think, played a very dominant role in national policy making in those IGR forums. But look, I think over and above picking individual bright spots that each jurisdiction unarguably has, the dynamic is still pretty much the same and has been for my whole time in and around government, and that is the Commonwealth has the money and makes policy and investment decisions, and the states, by and large, do the implementing. We have the big health systems, the big education systems, policing, law and order, et cetera, et cetera. It's a generalisation, but I think that's been a constant over the decades that I've seen. Commonwealth, lots of dough, good at policy, good at funding allocation, but the states have that real delivery expertise, still have to some extent that delivery expertise. And I just, I lament the fact that there's not enough time to have that conversation. You get the pre-reading, look at the agenda, you have the meeting, you check the communicator, make sure there's no one's doing anyone in, and then you move on. Whereas if we were able to spend more time informing the Commonwealth's policy decisions with the implementation implications, and vice versa, I think we'd get better decision making.
Yeah.
We might move on to robodebt, our favourite topic. So I'm going to do that annoying thing, Mike, where I read you back your own words, but it's your own fault for being super prominent on LinkedIn. But you have said good people, experienced public servants who lost their way and did the wrong thing. That's what robodebt is for you. And it comes down to constantly reminding ourselves that while we're expected to be faithful to the government of the day, we also need to be bold enough to stand up for the public interest. So here we go. Whose fault do you think robodebt is? Is it the elected officials or the public servants?
Well, I suspect you know that that's an easy question to ask, and that warrants a very, very convoluted and nuanced answer, which I'm sure we don't have time to give. But look, it just struck me that none of the public servants involved in robodebt were evil people. They did not wake up in the morning and go to work thinking, I'm going to do the public interest harm today. But they managed to get lulled into, and I'm speaking very generally, they managed to get lulled into doing quite bad things. And that's very common. Good people getting lulled into doing bad things because of culture, because of pressure, because of bullying, because of a power imbalance. All of those things I think are evident in robodebt, and we need to guard against them. And one of the ways I think public servants can guard against them, and I alluded to it in that post, is just you have to keep your sights on the public interest. That's who we're here for. Again, in the early days of being a Director General in Queensland, someone from the property division within the Queensland government was having a conversation with me, and I was trying to understand their work more. And I said, who do you consider you work for? Whose interests do you serve? And they said, we're here to serve developers' interests, because that's the way things get done. We're matched with, our primary external stakeholders are developers, and we're internal to government to help ensure that they can get things done. I thought, whoa. We're here to serve the public interest. We sometimes achieve that by partnering with different partners external to government, in this case, the development industry. But you have to keep your sights on what's in the public interest. Now, that's an easy thing to say. It gets very complicated in day-to-day life in the public service, as we found in robodebt. It all got terribly confused.
Yeah, and I think one of the confusions, if I think about it through that lens, is that I think that some of the people involved thought it was in the public interest, right? They actually thought that, really hardline pursuit of debts that were owed, was in the public interest, and that it was in the public interest for them to be effective and get the project done right. And so Danielle and I have presented on robodebt in lots of different places. And once a senior public servant with links to Queensland actually said to us at the end of the presentation, I wouldn't want the lesson to be that public servants should be more conservative, that they should, I don't want robodebt to be another excuse for no. And my sense from having watched lots of the things you say is that you would have a bit of sympathy with that, right? You want people to be active and doing and progressing. But I've also heard you talk about the importance of skepticism of what the bosses, being healthily skeptical. How do you navigate that tension between cutting through and doing, but also a culture of healthy skepticism of maybe maybe the thing we're doing isn't quite right?
Yeah, look, and these things are always much clearer in hindsight than when you're going through them. When I think there's a lot of that in robodebt, even though some of it, frankly, should have been obvious. But look, skepticism. I'm a fan of skepticism. I'm not a fan of cynicism, but healthy skepticism is quite different. And skepticism ought to help you with the wisdom to say yes, provided that, rather than no. Skepticism helps you to get to what the provided that should be. So particularly in portfolios that deal with the private sector, you need oodles of skepticism to work your way through what the underlying motivations are and what the public interest is in those circumstances where there's a lot of money involved, where there are big decisions involved that can have very, very lasting impacts on economies and communities, you need a lot of scepticism, but you can't allow that scepticism to get in the way of a yes. It's a challenging and nuanced thing.
No, I love that. I love that. It's like, and I guess people capture that sometimes in the yes, if, or,
yes, but, yes, and,
whatever that framing is.
Provided that,
but I really like, that's a more robust framing for me about skepticism as the precondition of getting to yes in places where there are really. Yeah, that's brilliant. Look, you were, we've got a lot of Queensland listeners, as it happens, and we get some great recommendations for public sector failures all across Australia, but we've had a few to look at from Queensland. And so I feel I need to shout out to the great people who've recommended those. So in particular, the Queensland Health Payroll Fiasco, which I've spent some of my holidays listening to the Commission of Inquiry on. And look,
she just knows how to have fun, this girl, right? Like, she just really knows what a Boxing Day should be spent doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, better than boxing my children. But at a high level, there seems to have been kind of very poor planning, a naive client in the form of Queensland Health, some juicy MOG shared services stuff going on where people, and then a kind of project that felt too big to fail. I guess first my question is, to me, it seems like robodebt, it really was a public service cock-up, not a ministerial cock-up in the sense of it was the mechanics that got messed up. But did you were in Premier Bligh's offices, some of it was rumbling along. Did you even have a sense? I'm always fascinated, do the minister's offices have a sense as these kind of things are gestating and haven't gone bad yet? And kind of, do you have any observations of that time or any reflections?
Well, until recently, one of my real fortes was staying one step ahead of the posse. So I'd actually left Anna Bligh's office by the time the health payroll problem emerged. But there's no doubt that it was happening while I was there. It was clearly happening while I was the Premier's Chief of Staff. But I think your observation is a very fair one. Ministerial accountability has to have some practical limits, and I don't think it's unreasonable for a minister to be able to say, we're allocating this money to a highly technical area of reform that involves, IT and a system deep down in the bowels of the department. I expect that project to be well run. So, ministerial accountability should have some practical limits. I think that's a very, very fair observation. Look, it's, in health payroll issue is playing out in various degrees of severity every day in every department. When I was facing up to estimates one year, I decided to ask the department to list for me every consultancy that the department had entered into over the last 12 months. And I got the list, and it was quite a substantial list with quite a substantial price tag attached to it. And I looked at the list and I recalled many of them. There's many that I didn't recall. But I came to the conclusion that about half of them had not delivered on their scope. Half of them had not delivered value, roughly. And so I dug further into that. And of that half that didn't deliver value, I reckon 2/3 was our fault. Poorly scoped jobs, poor project governance, not holding contractors to account, just basic poor contract management.
Not making decisions, so leaving people being paid, just twiddling their thumbs, waiting for government to decide which direction they wanted or which colour or, procedures. But
precisely. So many of those were happening under my nose in my own department that didn't have the consequences that the health payroll problem had. That one blew up and had massive consequences. And the consequences tend to be ongoing too. Both sides of politics in Queensland, when in office since then, have had a real reluctance to invest in system change. And that reluctance now means that, there's a lot of systems, and I'm sure it's not just the case in Queensland, there's a lot of systems across government in every jurisdiction that are being held together by sticky tape and chewing gum because of that basic reluctance to kind of, don't touch that, it might end up like the health payroll issue. But it comes down to, having those skills, developing the capability to do basic things like good contract management and hold service providers to account.
And I think we can sometimes think that that's like a kind of like it's something that you should intuitively be able to go. Like I sometimes think, I'm pretty good at some stuff. But in one of my last roles, we ended up doing a giant CRM rollout across a big part of my business. And, like I went and got the money and I made sure we had enough money for it and da-da-da-da. And then sort of about 3 months in, someone came and said, actually, we need to take someone offline to do the business requirements. I'm like, what the? We haven't done the business requirements and we haven't taken someone like it didn't even occur to me until it was said out loud to me, A, that we needed to do it and then that we hadn't done it, both of those sorts instantly. Like how do you build that, and particularly IT projects, and almost everything's an IT project now. Have you seen where people have done a really good job at upskilling?
I think the agencies that do a lot of it and are very, very dependent on their systems, do a pretty good job. Like I think of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, for example.
Yeah.
They run absolutely critical licensing systems, traffic management systems, those sorts of things. They tend to have very capable people with these sorts of skills who manage the life out of a project, and get it delivered mostly. So there's some agencies, it tends to be those agencies where it's not their bread and butter, it's not their core skill. And instead of borrowing people from another agency that have the skills, health, who don't have great capability in this space, or certainly didn't back then, decide to do it for themselves. And that's where things go wrong. So we're very poor at sharing capable resources across agencies. Contract management is a skill and an attitude that can be taught, it can be learnt, it's a capability. And sometimes it would be nice to think that you can just borrow those capabilities from an agency who has it as their bread and butter.
It's interesting that you've added that reticence to failure by governments. I've commented on this podcast before that when a minister can cut a ribbon on an ICT system, that'll be a happy day for government, because so much of our infrastructure, they can stand in front of a road, they can stand in front of a new school hall. What they can't stand in front of is MyGov, Medicare, the new online tap to get on a train, whatever it is. That's harder to connect the community to. You wouldn't want premiers and ministers, after they've allocated here's the money, here's what it's supposed to do, and it's supposed to open inside. You don't want them in those weeds. I had thought it was a lack of kind of sexiness and the inevitable blowouts that meant governments were so reticent, and we have so many legacy systems just absolutely hanging on together with sticky tape. It hadn't actually occurred to me that the failure of them, and there have been a lot in health, not just the Queensland payroll scandal, there's a lot of records management. E-health records has been a very struggly street project for the Commonwealth for a very long time. So it's been such a struggle street project that it was started when I was a graduate.
Never ending, yeah.
And I have I'm 50% grey. And so I hadn't recognised that it's political risk now as well that is the other layer of lack of interest in investment, I suppose, in ICT systems, which I think is a good segue to this issue of delivery. So you sing to my song, Mike, when you talk about delivery being at the heart of trust in government. So, when we go to intergov meetings and we go to facilitated sessions, we are living in a bubble. People experience government in a public hospital, in a public school, putting their tax return in, trying to apply for a visa. Like, that is how they experience government, and how they experience it is how much trust they have in us.
Yeah.
And as your homework, we sent you the Ezra Klein pod episode, which talks about how in the US, Democrats can get a bit stuck in defending the way government runs, partly because of a fear of Republicans destroying the institution itself, and partly because of some of the dysfunctions in their governments come from left-leaning agendas. And there's this boggling example in that episode, and we'll link to it in the show notes because honestly, pod listeners, I think you'll all thoroughly enjoy it. There's this example that, when they start talking about it, it's about removing discrimination, and I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And you get to the end of this recruitment example, And it leads to the most stupid process I've ever heard of in my entire life.
Yeah.
And we see a little bit of
self-assessment is what it led
self-assessment.
to.
Like, it was just boggling. And when they started explaining it, I was like, oh, yes, this is all sounding good. And about a quarter of the way through it, the wheels started just rolling off this example. So we see a little bit of that attention in Australia with some incoming Conservative governments sometimes wanting to kind of actively dismantle state capability because what's there isn't working. So not fix it, but dismantle it. And some of them don't necessarily believe in the role of government. And some incoming left of centre governments promising more government, but not really, in my view, ever focusing on retooling it, upskilling it and making it work. It's like just the size and scale and what it should deliver is its focus. There are some exceptions on both sides. There will always be exceptions. That's a very kind of unnuanced description. But I'm interested in your reflections on that. Like, does it resonate as a diagnosis? You've worked for Labor premiers. How much were they thinking about blowing up bits of government that just weren't working? And how much were they thinking, I think, about fixing bits of government that weren't working?
Well, I don't want to be political about it. I think it's, as you've identified, it's an issue on every side of politics. By and large, politicians don't want to have to think about the mechanics of government productivity. You know, they're there to make policy decisions, make funding allocations, and they hope and expect the rest will happen. And they don't want to, and nor really is it their job to kind of get down into the bowels of a department and weed out inefficiency and zombie projects. I mean, I love to call them zombie projects. They're things that some minister asked us to do 10 years ago, and lo and behold, there's still a unit working on it, even though no one values it. No one even remembers why it was established. But, you know, there's still 10 people down there somewhere working on it. I mean, a lot of this, I think, has to come down to public sector leadership. You know, it's easy to blame politicians, and they'll all have a perspective about the effectiveness and efficiency and size of the public service. But in my observation, public sector leaders, generally speaking, could do a better job of grasping the nettle themselves and saying, this isn't working, this is inefficient, this is silly, this doesn't pass the pub test. I'm a highly paid leader of an organisation, effectively a CEO. I've got to do something about this. There's a lot of turning a blind eye in the public service to inefficiency and ineffectiveness, and it's not the politicians' fault; it's our fault because we don't lead like, say, a private sector leader might when it comes to inefficient resource allocation. And of course, you know, the more we don't do that, the more we then create the circumstances where we get an overreaction like Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, you know, and we all risk that. We all risk that at some point if we don't lead and if we don't do the things that we've got discretion ourselves to do. I mean, obviously, if it means ending a service, you've got to take that to the minister. Or if it means taking a different policy approach to service delivery, you've got to take that to government, to elected government. But there's a lot public service leaders can do themselves just to rid the place of inefficiency and ineffectiveness.
And in fact, I've known some naughty public service leaders who might, when asked for efficiencies, offer up the thing they know won't be accepted. Like the number of times we talk about, too much local footprint in regional areas. They're like, we could be much more efficient. You're like, no, that's not okay. That's not the public value bit. That's not the bit you should be blowing up.
Yeah, well, we're not called bureaucrats for nothing. You know, so we all know all of those tricks, but ultimately it doesn't serve the public, and it doesn't even serve the public sector's interest to do that. And we risk an overreaction like Musk, and heaven knows how that's going to end.
Indeed.
So that's about public sector leadership, and your take on leadership, and you take that idea very, very seriously, and we love your contrarian take on competency frameworks, just partly because we like contrarian takes. And also just because these things are often presented to public sector leaders as like, we found it, we've got the answer. And anyone who says, I don't know, that doesn't actually ring true for me, is seen as like not really joining the program. So I'm a bit of a contrarian at the best of times. So tell us a little bit about what your view is on competency frameworks.
Well, this is one of those, lessons I've learnt over the decades, and frankly, one of the mistakes I used to make in leading teams previously, I think. Competency frameworks are based on the flawed notion that there's lists of boxes you have to tick that you have to have before you can do a good job of X, Y, or Z. Now, at a very technical level, at lower levels of the public service, I kind of get that. But as you move up through the ranks, it just focusing people on what they're missing, focusing people on their so-called weaknesses, just gives you a really appalling return on investment as you develop them as leaders. The far, far better approach in all of the evidence and all of the research I've seen, the far better approach is to help people to identify their strengths, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Help them identify their strengths and then invest wildly in those. Get them to double down on those. Now, you can't ignore weaknesses, particularly if they're career limiting, but you get a much better return on investment if you identify strengths and invest in those, and then give people the confidence and ability to lead in a wonderfully idiosyncratic way, using those strengths to find their leaderships, to find their own unique leadership style. So that's just a take on and every HR department I've encountered says we take a strengths-based approach, and it's just crap because they use the competency models to point out to people where their flaws and weaknesses are, and then offer them training modules that you can supposedly kind of plug in to fix your problem, and it just doesn't work.
Don't you think there's also something in there about the idea that if you're a good leader, you would be a good leader in every circumstance? Whereas actually, I think like part of using your strengths is being in the right kind of role and the right kind of leadership role. Like some people are kind of good, everything's fallen over and you just try to put the pieces back together. Some people are really good optimizing leaders. Some people do you think everyone can be a great leader in every context?
No, of course not, because not everyone ticks every box on that competency list. But what you do need to do in shaping up teams and pulling people around you as a leader is find people who have strengths that you lack.
Yeah.
That's how you plug those gaps, Mike. It's not an online training module. It's recruit to your failure. Go and ask all the details-orientated direct reports I've had who have plugged the gaps of my arm flapping kind of approach to that.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas HR and the competency model would tell you to go and fix that problem, and it's just a poor return on investment. So I know, for example, that I need someone who will counterbalance my recklessness. I love it. I need someone who will tell me, whoa, there be dragons. Don't go there. Because in my kind of impatient quest to get to the outcome, I'll cut corners and make mistakes. So I know I need someone around me who will say, whoa up.
Not that one.
Yeah.
Can't step on that one. Yep.
What a cracking way, perhaps, to finish up, Caroline. Mike, thank you so much. We want to get you back because we put a call out on LinkedIn to ask a secretary, director general, chief executive when I'm boss of the world. You'll all have one name. And we got some cracking questions from our listeners. So thank you so much for your time today, and we will see you for another episode very soon. Till next time.
Thank you.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.